Hello, my name is Tony Jones, and you're tuned in to The Coalition, where we discuss all sides of local, regional, and national news, politics, and current events online at coalitionradio.us. Don't forget you can interact with the program if you're catching us live throughout the broadcast on Twitter at coalition_radio and on Facebook at The Coalition Radio. And of course, don't forget to check out The Coalition on iTunes. With me in studio, my gracious and lovely co-host, Christine is here. Chris, good evening.
Good evening, Tony.
Especially lovely this evening is the P.O. taxpayer. P.O., good evening.
Good evening.
You look like you're having a rough week, P.O. You look like you have been ridden hard and put away wet.
That would put it mildly. I spent quality time in upstate New York this week. Now, for those amongst us in Little Rhodey, we often describe upstate New York as like Westchester County or, God forbid, Albany. I could see the St. Lawrence River from where I am. Now, for those of you who are graduates of the Rhode Island public school systems, that's north. Okay? So
very, very, very north.
Very, 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 very north. And it really proves something to me. First of all, the outside temperature while I was driving my hardy little Ford Focus around the Great White North, if you will, was 14 below zero. Now, that's not some wimpy Giorgi factor. That's not some wind chill. That's not some invention by the Weather Channel. It was 14 degrees below zero. I can't even imagine what the wind chill was. The airport we flew into, and by the way, a shout out to the fine folks at Cape Air. If you have to go north for God only knows what reason, for the love of God, all right, they are the people to go with. It was a fabulous flight as we flew into I felt like I was on a reality show on A&E. But as I spent 3 or 4 days up there, it occurred to me how normal folks were up there and how normally they were taking what essentially a fraction of which has shut down the entire state of Rhode Island. There was no whining, no complaining. Children went to school. People worked. People went about their daily lives. They dressed warmly. They did not need to be told by the government how to dress. They did not need to be told by the government how to eat or how to spend that week. Somehow they managed to survive, Chris. What has happened down here in southern New England? Have we become complete wimps?
Well, I think part of the issue is the weather is like that for them all the time up there, so they're used to it. I mean, if you go to a place like Atlanta, if they get a dusting of snow, the entire city shuts down because they don't have plows. They're not prepared for it.
But we think of ourselves as tough and hardy.
Well,
here.
we think of ourselves that way, but A, we're perhaps not as tough and hardy as upstate New Yorkers, and B, a large part of the reason they tell people to stay home is because we're bad drivers in the snow.
Okay.
And
it's
we
not
have
so much
roads
the snow
like
itself.
the surface of the moon. That doesn't help.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, you're driving along and you think you see a little dusting of snow there, and you suddenly end up with a broken axle because it's a nice big pothole you didn't see.
Well, I guess on your favorite website, the Drudge Report, Chris, it mentioned that this is the coldest winter in 100 years.
For all you Seinfeld fans out there, significant shrinkage.
And yes, it moved. But, I mean, the global warming haters instantly get on and can't wait to prove. What was it? One person who came up with this called it cold weather porn. In a sense, every time the weather would get a little bit colder, the climate change people or the anti-climate change people would get up and make the same Al Gore jokes that we've been listening to for 10 years now.
Right.
Do they? And I have a very mixed opinion about the whole climate change argument. I do believe, though, that we put too much carbon dioxide into the air, and I think that has an effect on the environment. I think we can all agree on that.
Right.
But do you think at this point the obsession with global warming ruined the potential for a legitimate argument about climate change?
Well, I think the reason the term has been changed to climate change, which of course the global warming deniers laugh at, but the reason that the term was changed was because all of the current models, which are getting more sophisticated, basically predicted that more extreme weather events in all different dimensions would be happening. And that is what we're seeing. So we're seeing oddball polar vortexes dipping down further into the states than they used to. We're seeing snow in England, which they rarely see. It's now becoming a more commonplace thing.
Is that necessarily a bad thing?
I don't know that I would say snow in England is necessarily a bad thing, but I think the more extreme weather situations could be a bad thing.
Then they can't get to their dental appointments.
Well, that would be this week's excuse.
I have a lot of fans and friends and people that listen to my other show in England, so I should not have said that.
Well,
No, you shouldn't. You're going to be getting some cranky tweets over there. But one thing that is, I just read about this in, I forget which website it was. It might have been the New York Times.
then it must be true.
Well, the head of Coca-Cola is saying we need to do something about climate change because it's affecting their business.
Despite the fact that fizzy soda is accountable for? I don't know. I wish that somehow the two sides could come together and present legitimate, unfettered, shall we say, untainted by emotion arguments.
Right.
I think it's time for
And
that.
untainted by politics, too.
True.
In other parts of the world, there isn't this sharp divide between conservatives who think it's not happening and liberals who think it is.
And just remember that anytime you give people a chance to get whipped into a tizzy for no reason, which, by the way, the Super Bowl is coming up, they will take it.
Right.
Well, does that have to do with the absence of Cheese Whiz suddenly on the American plane?
Yeah, there's a shortage of Cheese Whiz and Velveeta.
Okay.
Or at least there's an alleged shortage.
Is there a difference between Velveeta and Cheese Whiz?
I think Cheese Whiz is the aerosolized version.
Of
The
Velveeta?
squirt kind, yeah.
Okay.
Well, they're both called cheese food products or something.
Genuine imitation cheese like
Yeah,
food
they're
products,
not
okay.
legally allowed to call it cheese.
Okay. Well,
So draw your own conclusions.
There you go. So my hat's off to the people in upstate New York. I think we need a little intervention. I think we need to bring a few of them down here to Halitosis Hall and introduce, what real people are like.
Right.
And just remember that as the cold season wears on, we've only just begun.
I hope so. Speaking of real people, the fallen angel this week, for those of you not in the know who haven't listened before, that's how we refer to Angel Tavares, the mayor for life, I think, of Providence, leaped to the fore this week in a stunning move of great courage and great political bravery. Right after he had announced he was against cancer, liked the Little League, thought kids should play soccer, decided to announce for a $10 and change minimum wage. Now, that's been a subject of great debate on this show over the year or so that we're approaching in business here. What say you, Chris?
I'm in favor of it.
Who's going to pay for it, though? Let me throw this out there. Much is made in the minimum wage movement of the fact that, large corporations like Walmart are seemingly being subsidized by food stamps.
Well, not seemingly. They actually are being subsidized.
Oh,
by
okay.
food
Well,
stamps.
there you go again with absolutes.
There's nothing seemingly about it.
Okay.
It's been proven.
All right. So Walmart employees, even in a state like Rhode Island, accounts for probably, 1% of the employment base. Which, by the way, their percentage of employment is growing every month as we lose more and more jobs. All right. But predominantly, Rhode Island is a small, when I say closely held business, where you've got one or two individuals who are the owners, primarily under 50 employees. If you raise the wage significantly like that, there's two ways that the business can account for it. Number one, they can either raise prices, or number two, they can employ people for less amounts of time. Usually it's some combination of the two. Now, coincidentally, this week, we had unemployment figures released. Newsflash, Rhode Island lost more jobs on an absolute basis, and I think the only measurement that matters is how many jobs there are. I think anything else is a complete perversion of statistics. Newsflash, Massachusetts, unemployment dropped and gained 5 digits worth of jobs. So if you raise minimum wage, which, again, we all agree people need to, human potential should be realized fully. We need to pay people, people should be living well. It gives no one pleasure, well, except a few, but it gives no one pleasure to see people living in poverty. But ultimately, if the net result is to drive out what few businesses are left, understand if we raise the minimum wage so that it's 15% higher than Massachusetts, who has a 1% lower sales tax, what's going to be left of the type of low skill retail like minimum wage jobs that are available? What's left is going to continue to move north. So if we're, the proverbial cutting off our nose to spite our face, if we're cutting employment, we can say, boy, we showed them you had the potential to make more money, but you're not now. What do we prove, Chris?
Well, typically, minimum wage increases have not led to mass waves of unemployment. The unemployment we're seeing now isn't related to a minimum wage increase. It's related to other market forces. I would like very much for our governments to actually be paying more attention to the other market forces, to be looking at Massachusetts and figuring out what Massachusetts is doing correctly in the overall business sense. Mm-hmm. How are they nurturing businesses? How are they keeping their economy working? What are they doing that we're not?
Well, and why?
I feel that the minimum wage increase would be blamed for things that it's not responsible for.
Perhaps. I mean, you'll see both sides of the issue marginalize it and at the same time politicize it. But if you make doing business more expensive, which arguably, I mean, there's no question, you pay more people, it's more expensive. On a declining employment base in an economy that's not only stalled, it's disintegrating before our eyes, how is that a win for the people who live here?
No, I'd rather see business taxes on property, other business taxes be lowered to enable people to put more money in their employees' pockets.
You know, about a month or two ago, we had Mike Stenhouse here, who continually argues for the 0% sales tax, which we can all agree, you know, whether you're left or right, progressive right or center, is the most regressive tax other than gambling here in Rhode Island. It just screams out at this point, even if you don't eliminate it completely, the situation just screams for a significant reduction to attract money back into the state, so that people's real potential can be realized in a positive manner. We're not just stroking checks at people.
It would be an interesting experiment. I don't think anyone has a 0% sales tax, do they?
New Hampshire, and by the way, New Hampshire's economy continues to grow.
Right.
You know, New Hampshire's economy,
that might be worth looking into.
Well, again, we're surrounded. How is it that you can have such disparate situations? I mean, I sit on my front lawn in Cumberland. I can see the Massachusetts border. How is it that 100 yards away, you can have better schools, lower taxes, higher household incomes?
I'm picturing you with your nose pressed up against a chain link fence, looking at the Emerald City on the other side there.
and me perpetually on the other. Well, you know, the panda bear, Miss Gina Raimondi, couldn't wait to go, yeah, me too. Whatever Angel says that is at all left of center, she's right there in some sort of twisted Greek chorus. She is allowing Angel Tavares to dictate the conversation.
Right.
Which is, again, astonishing. I know we talk about this every week. You know, we're a political show here. You know, this is the area of focus, the gubernatorial. Even though other...
You're just mad because she hasn't made you any cookies yet. Let's face it. All these cookies on your Facebook page, and you haven't gotten one yet.
I ain't getting none. I don't think it's going to happen at this point. But constantly just aping whatever the fallen angel has to say. And barely an original thought. Have you seen anything out from her campaign since she's announced that would spark... I mean, here's a woman who is, a Rhodes Scholar? She's, regardless of how you feel about her politics, she's a strong character. She's brilliant intellectually, comes from some of the finest business environments known to man, and yet we see nothing in terms of innovation from her other than stock, hardcore Democratic Party programs, none of which have ever worked anywhere at any time. You know, it's like a friend of mine on the radio says, let's double down on stupid. You know, let's look at the same mistakes we're making, the same mistakes that brought us to this point, and we clearly haven't done enough of that. So let's do some more. So if there's anybody out there listening from the Raimondi campaign, how about mixing in an original thought or not just standing there being a chorus for the opposition candidates?
Or at least switch up the menu.
There you go.
Yeah, let's see a bunt cake.
Well, this week, very, very excited to have our guest in. We're going to talk about religion, since we've already continually talked about the other subjects that we're not supposed to talk about, politics and sex on the radio. We're going to talk about religion. Tony, did you grow up in a religious environment?
I did. I grew up Baptist, and then most recently, I worship at a Unitarian church over in East Greenwich, a fantastic congregation over there.
Chris?
I grew up Catholic, and I now consider myself a secular humanist.
She was an altar boy.
I was an altar boy.
I grew up as a papist. one of the Romans, as I used to say in Ireland. 11 years an altar boy. You can draw from whatever conclusions you like from that.
Did you get to ring the little bell?
I got to ring a little bell. Although, here's a confession I'm going to make in public for the first time. One of the reasons I was an altar boy, I made some serious coin back in the 70s. All right, weddings, even in the 70s, you could score $20-25 for a wedding.
Really?
All right, honest to God. See?
Now, like legit, or were you grabbing it out of the offering?
No, that was separate. But no, the best man, who was usually, 3 sheets, it was an Irish church, 3 sheets to the wind at that point, would slip you at 20 each of the altar boys.
I did not know that.
It was, the funerals were a little tougher. You'd make $2 or $3 on a funeral. But again, if you were 12 years old in 1972, this was serious coin. So you had the fear of God, man. You believed in the baby Jesus.
So I had no idea. So I would have been even more irritated not to be able to be an altar boy.
Oh, that's right. You weren't allowed even on the altar.
No, I was not allowed on the altar. I think they allow them now.
Wasn't that a mortal sin at that point?
Nah.
Yeah, the church I belonged to, that was a mortal sin. You
must have been to a hardcore Irish.
Yeah, absolutely. My sister married a Methodist, which in 1969, where she met him in 73, you needed a papal dispensation,
right,
to marry someone. So I'll never forget, as a 13-year-old, my father was confronted by the parish priest, who said, "Oh, Patrick, are you disappointed your daughter didn't marry one of the faith?" My father looks him square in the eyes, and I'll never forget this. It's been 40 years. Well, he's not Irish, but we love him anyway. And that was my first taste of a religious rebellion. So I'm a practicing Methodist. I believe in God as I become adopted more of the beliefs of Ayn Rand. I don't know if I could call myself secular, because I do believe in a deity. However, I can increasingly throw off the shackles of religion and all its constrictions and its politics and its money raising and its obsession with political power here in this. So I say all of that because I want us to have an open conversation with our guest. We've got with us Stephen Ahlquist. Now, as I've remarked consistently on this show, we are an outrage porn-free zone. So we don't discuss Christmas trees, and what else do we not discuss? Prayer banners.
Right.
So we are striking that from the conversation. That's old news. It's been beaten to death. Although I've always wanted to say on the radio to Stephen, do you know that on the dollar bill they say "In God We Trust"?
I have heard that, yes.
Well, Stephen comes to us with quite a pedigree. In your official bio, you're a writer, an artist, and an activist in Providence, Rhode Island. You're a founder and president of the Humanists of Rhode Island. As an activist, you work in the areas of human rights, church-state separation, and freedom of conscience. You're a regular contributor to progressive blog, rifuture.com. We're hoping that you're going to join us, and because I've read a lot of your stuff. It's great stuff. It's thought-provoking. I hope today will be, but we want you to contribute to our website. What's our blog, Tony?
Coalitionradio.us.
Clearly, and I'm going to turn the mic over to you in a second, but clearly you gained, I would say, a pretty heady mix of fame and with a touch of notoriety based on the events of a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we've moved on to that. But to give us your definition of a humanist.
For me, I focus on 4 values, which are reason, compassion, optimism, and action. And I look at that as a basis for what I do. My group does not believe in God. We consider ourselves atheists, or at least atheists in a sense that we don't live our lives as if there is no God, atheist without God, literally. And so as a secular humanist, I think that the government should be secular, providing a platform for everybody to have whatever beliefs they want.
What was your upbringing?
I was born Catholic. I was raised Catholic. My father was a Baptist, but I was raised Catholic.
And at what point was there one seminal event in your life that actually that started this move in your life?
Not really. I had 2 brothers. We talked a lot. We read comics. We watched TV. And as we talked about stuff, we kind of started to think that, myths that we read, like Greek myths and Norse myths, were pretty much similar to what we were seeing in the Bible and seeing in church. And we kind of came to the conclusion together that it was probably all myth.
What do you see as the role of religion in society as it's used right now?
Well, I would like to see less of it. I don't know that it has a great role. I think too often it leads to division. Too often it leads into people doing terrible things. There are times when it can do some positive things, but those positive things, I think, are given. In those times, religion is given too much credit. I think people inherently are basically decent, despite the fact that Christianity tells you that people are inherently flawed and sinful. I don't think that's true. And I think what we do when we do good things, we think, well, I did that because of religion. I think we did it in spite of religion. I also think people are better than their religions as a whole.
In another part of my life, and when I was in sophomore in high school, we took our world cultures class, and it was the first time I was presented with the notion that religion existed as a way to create order in society and to create a sense of ethics and ethos.
Right.
That's a remarkably gentle way of putting it. Is that still important?
I don't know that religion has ever been a way of bringing order to society. I think we've kind of ritualized certain things that are in society. For instance, we look at like other animals and they can treat each other well, or they can have tribal affiliations, or they can do certain things. Humans can do that too, but as we started to get more intelligent and put labels on it, we started to think in terms of religion. And we started to think, well, where do these things come from? Where do these ideas of being nice to each other come from? And we started to invent concepts like gods. But I don't think that the gods came first. I think we were decent to each other first, and then came up with gods afterwards.
Or at least the striving to be decent toward each other.
Yeah, striving to be decent. Right. I don't think obviously we're not always decent to each other.
Right,
and obviously
but
we are.
The impulse, if you will.
Right.
To want to be decent to each other.
Mm-hmm. I think that's inherent.
Do you think there's a class of people that needs a god, that needs some sort of outside force to quote unquote tell them how to behave?
I think about that a lot, and I'm not so sure. I think that some people believe in God for various reasons, and some people don't believe in God for various reasons. And I don't know that there's an awful lot of... I don't think you can talk someone out of a belief in God. You can't talk someone into a belief in God. When you come to that belief, however it is, if you're going to change, you're going to do it on your own, and not because somebody came up with a clever argument either way.
I can't think of any time in history since possibly the Reformation when, well, let's just say the world is almost always at war. A significant part of the world is engaged in some type of conflict. Mm-hmm. But it would appear at this point in history, since really the Reformation, that the entire world, a significant portion of the wars going on are rooted in religion.
It seems that way, although I have read statistics that say that most wars are not religious-based. I think a lot of religious strife, there's an awful lot of religious strife in the world, and I see it in the Iran and Iraq, the Shiite and the Sunnis and stuff like that, and we're seeing Buddhists killing Muslims now.
Right.
So, yeah, there's an awful lot of religious hatred, but I don't know if that translates into full war. I think wars are still basically economic and political in nature more than religious, but
well, a lot of these religious wars are actually ethnic wars too.
Mm-hmm. Ethnicity is a big deal, right?
The dividing line happens to lie along both.
So then would the absence of any religion at all, do you think, mitigate the current circumstances we're in?
I think it would slightly decrease, but I don't think it would eliminate most of the wars. I think if we were to wave a wand and make religion disappear, I think there would still be a lot of war in the world.
Well, I think religion is often the excuse that's used as opposed to the reason for it.
Right. I think that's true.
So you think religion, in a sense, gives folks a banner under which to operate? And
it gives them a reason to excuse themselves and to forgive themselves for the atrocities they commit during war.
Right, or to use that to rally their troops.
Mm-hmm.
These people are our enemies because they believe something outrageous.
Right.
When in actual fact, it's got more to do with property for the 1%.
Right. We even used that in the lead up to the Gulf, the recent Iraq war, where Bush was talking about words like crusade at first.
Right.
He was using those kind of loaded theological terms to get America all gemmed up until he was called on it, and then all of a sudden crusade was off the books because we don't actually want to commit crusade against Islam. We want to, remove Saddam Hussein from power.
So tell us about then your organization here in Rhode Island. We've got about 5 minutes before the break, but
okay.
Your organization here in Rhode Island and, what other folks you're working with and how you've evolved in terms of your thinking on
Sure.
local issues.
Well, when we first started, my focus was going to be on doing service projects, which is stuff like working with Habitat for Humanity or working with, doing cleanups and that kind of stuff. And then on the other side would be our political stuff. And our political stuff would be working for church-state separation and human rights issues. And that means going down to the State House and speaking on certain bills. It means we've joined some coalitions We joined a reproductive rights coalition so that we can ensure that women have the right to safe and legal abortions. And we've come out with we're working with other coalitions. We've even worked with some interfaith coalitions as well. And the reason we do the two-pronged attack, I think, is because many people look at a group like ours and say, well, I know plenty of religious people who put their money where their mouth is, and they do plenty of good in this society, but your group, all they do is complain, and I didn't want to be a group that just complained. I wanted to be a group that demonstrated our values through action, which is one of the reasons I put action in our 4 primary values. We want to be an active group that does things that we see as helping to better society.
Do you think some of the good you do gets lost in the what we call the outrage porn of Rhode Island media?
Yeah, that does happen. And I can put out a press release saying that we're doing a highway cleanup, and nobody will show up and nobody covers it. I can put out a thing that we're going to the State House to argue against a a choose life license plate bill, and that will get plenty of attention. And so, yes, I think that people would rather be outraged by us than see us as working with, not against, the interests of Rhode Island. So
are you saying then that there are Rhode Island politicians who use outrage against your organization as political cover for their inaction on other events?
Perish the thought.
That could be. When I went and spoke on marriage equality, I had a senator respond to my brief 3-minute, whatever you call it, testimony with 20 minutes of Bible readings and outrage. And that was quite surprising to me. But he went on for quite a while, actually read the Bible to me while I was sitting in the Senate.
Interesting. And did you remember who the senator was?
It was Senator Metz.
Senator Metz.
Yeah, okay. Providence.
So his entire argument against it was not secular. It had to do with the notion that religious law should rule the state? Yeah, that seemed to be where he was coming from, that his interpretation of the New Testament, the Bible, should be where we base our laws, which was, I thought, completely contrary to anything that I would like to see our state doing. Well, in the next segment, we are going to touch on the whole notion of the deists in terms of the founding fathers, and the notion of rights granted to the individual by God, and as part of our fundamental publications, and in this country. But as we've evolved out of sort of the early crisis du jour stage from, say, a year and a half to 2 years ago, do you see a growth in acceptance in terms of the theory, at least at the higher levels of Rhode Island government, or is folks still overwhelmingly, quote unquote, we're the most Catholic religious state in the country? I think we're starting to make a dent in that viewpoint, that we're the most Catholic state and that there isn't a secular, humanist, and neutral outlook to the way we should be dealing with religious issues in the state. Interesting. Absolutely. What I enjoyed was you wrote a piece, or you were involved in a piece about the Knights of Columbus here in Rhode Island. I find it, as someone who likes to skewer gourds, I find it continually amusing that, on one hand, we'll portray ourselves as an overwhelmingly Catholic state. Right. And one has to question then how the Catholic Church feels about being overwhelmingly capitalist when we fund our state significantly by gambling. Prostitution is rampant. A significant industry in this state is adult entertainment. Political corruption, we are amongst the worst in the nation, and yet at the same token, we're overwhelmingly Catholic. How do those jive, Chris? I'm at a loss. They don't really jive. I think the Catholic leadership in the state likes to think of us as being majority Catholic, but a lot of people are Catholic in name only these days, for starters, and for seconds, the Catholic leadership is very focused on a narrow range of issues and isn't looking at things like the fact that we're dependent on gambling money, or the fact that we've got this massive adult entertainment industry. I don't remember, I don't follow everything that gets said by the bishop, but I don't remember him really making those signature issues. I remember I had an opportunity through the miracle of talk radio to question his predecessor briefly, because as I will always say, our talk radio is Rhode Island's town hall. It's one of the few places where the ham and eggers like myself get to question the high and mighty. And when I asked about the lottery, because as a Methodist and as a Protestant, that's a huge issue for us. We take gambling very, very seriously. We see it in all its inherent evils, both on a moral and a practical basis. When he told me he wasn't that concerned about that, I was left somewhat astonished. Now, someone like that, you get one question. You don't get follow-ups like you do here on Rhode Island's town hall, the coalition. So I would love the opportunity, if anyone out there listens, to have someone in the Catholic religion, the superstructure, if you will, that shadow government for Rhode Island. Because as you point out, how many active members of the Knights of Columbus are in the legislature?
I forget the exact number, but I think there was 4 in the Senate or 3 in the Senate, and 4. It was like 7 or 8.
Right, and a couple of them had been Grand Poobah, Grand Knight, Chief Water Buffaloes. Yeah, so we're to believe that there's this, overwhelming religious sense of sanctimony about Rhode Island politics. Yet at the same time, we see the results.
Right.
We're about halfway through the show, which means we need to take a quick break. Big thanks to everybody checking in on Twitter at Coalition_radio and on Facebook, facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. CoalitionRadio.us. We'll have more with our in-studio guest, Steve Ahlquist, after the break.
Be sure to log on to ProvidenceNightOut.com and don't forget to check their cell phone app. That's ProvidenceNightOut.com.
Hello, my name is Jim Gray, and I am a judge of the Superior Court in California and a former federal prosecutor in Los Angeles. I would like to talk to you for a moment about marijuana. Did you know that since the federal government first banned marijuana in 1937, usage in this country has actually gone up by about 4,000%? Or did you know that in the Netherlands, where adults are allowed to possess small amounts of marijuana and buy it from government-regulated businesses, fewer adults and fewer teenagers smoke marijuana than here in our country? Or that an American is arrested on marijuana charges every 38 seconds? If you are wondering if any of this makes sense, you are not alone. To find out more, contact the Marijuana Policy Project at 1-877-JOIN-MPP or visit them on the web at mpp.org. Thank you, and good luck to us all.
Hey everybody, it's Tony Jones. When I'm not here yakking about politics, I spin records. That's right, if you like good old-fashioned rock and roll radio the way God intended it to be, then tune in to The Tony Jones Show. The information's online at tonyjones.org. That's tonyjones.org.
13 Folds is your definitive source for cannabis culture, with a print magazine, radio show, live events, and so much more. Check them out online at 13folds.com. That's the number 13, FOLDS.com.
Tony Jones here. You are tuned in to the Coalition online at coalitionradio.us. Christine P.O., good evening.
Hey, buddy.
Steve Ahlquist, good evening.
Good evening.
Coming in on Twitter, I guess kind of for all of us, and this issue has been beaten to death earlier this week, but we'll touch on it briefly. The fact that the armed forces have tweaked the military uniform for any religious culture to be comfortable. You guys' thoughts?
Well, let me just lead off by saying I think it's an incredibly bad idea. I mean, if in a sense if the movement is to eliminate the religious from the political life, and I do believe that's appropriate, then why would we want to introduce it into an organization for whom cohesiveness, call it anonymity within the ranks and team building is critical?
And as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I don't really lean one way or the other, except for the fact that it's called a uniform, which means that it should be uniform.
Right.
Right, and when you talk about diversity, it's great that everybody's diverse. I would like to, for a while, though, celebrate the things we agree on.
Right.
And I think the military has to do that. I think the military has to act in an apolitical, areligious manner.
Right, and by definition, it's a hordes of individuals coming together, presumably for a common cause.
Exactly. The defense of our borders, regardless of whether that defense is a religious or a political issue. But Steve, how do you feel?
Well, as far as I understand, it's mostly about like whether or not Sikhs can wear their beards, or and little things like that. And I don't see facial hair as being a huge impediment to military duty. So I don't really have a big issue with it. I think if we can hold military cohesiveness and hold the ranks accountable, I don't see why very small, things like that would be a big problem. There was a time when being a soldier in America meant being a white male, too.
Right. Well, the beard issue is kind of odd anyway, because our troops have been encouraged while serving in the Middle East to grow beards so that they're fitting in culturally to some extent.
Right. We have such a mixed message, though. I mean, let me challenge you on it a little
Sure.
bit. I mean, if you truly believe that religion should be removed from, I'll call it political public life, then, in a sense, you're saying that the freedom from religion trumps the freedom to practice religion. Just theoretically. We're going to get into that some more.
Okay.
But in a military environment where you don't necessarily want to exhibit differences, not even because of political or religious reasons, but for reasons of cohesiveness and teamwork. Really drill people down to that they become truly color, religious, sexuality blind. Isn't that a mixed message then?
I don't know exactly that it is. I think that in the military, there is there's a higher level of cohesiveness desired than there is in society as a whole. And I think that, I do believe in freedom from religion, but I don't think we would want the government saying everybody has to grow a beard and conform to certain religious standards. And so that would be a problem. But if the government said we are going to relax standards so that people can feel comfortable expressing their identities slightly, I don't see that being a big deal. I don't think the military is going to lose control of itself because a few guys are growing beards or a few people want to wear a yarmulke under their hats or something on that idea. What's the difference between that and wearing a cross on a chain underneath your uniform?
Well, it's interesting, though, because in other areas, the military seems to be, particularly with regards to Christianity, seems to be sort of stepping on and trying to. It's almost like they've incorporated a don't ask, don't tell theory about people's Christianity. So
I think that would depend on which branch you're talking about and which sector in some cases. Apparently, the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs has a very heavy evangelical Christian presence that pervades all the way to the top.
Yeah. So, but if you're going to allow displays in terms of the uniform, for example, let's talk about the Sikhs, because I think we can all think back to on 9/11 how this poor guy who was a Sikh
was basically dragged out of his taxi.
Dragged out of a train and nearly lynched because of the incredible sophistication of the law enforcement apparatus here in Rhode Island. Yeah, okay. Regardless of the fact that Sikhs have, for 100 plus years, fought alongside of coalition forces in World War I and II, and amongst the bravest soldiers in the world, and let's throw that out. So they're very often used as an example because of the turban, the facial hair,
they
the sword.
The
sword doesn't help.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got the whole sword thing working for you. But if you in a military environment, I don't want to obsess over this because it was kind of beaten to death with this. But in a military environment, let me just say this: if you are allowed to exhibit differences, for those people then whose fundamental religious beliefs think that there's the only religion that matters, doesn't that then gin up feelings that probably shouldn't exist? It's a circular argument. It's circular logic. But
It'd be cool if they
it's
could wear
a
those 3 feet tall Pope hats. That would be awesome.
Yeah, where is the Swiss Guard when you need them? Let's talk about this country and the Founding Fathers.
Okay.
Much is made of the notion of who was a deist, who wasn't, the notion that our Bill of Rights and a lot of our fundamental freedoms are treated, in a sense, as being God-given.
Right.
It's a critical part of in a sense, it's also a function of the Magna Carta, so that men are inherently born with certain political rights. But the language exists that it's quote-unquote God-granted, God-given.
Yeah, created, endowed by their creator.
Exactly. Right. So how does that jive in terms of your feelings on American political life? I mean, what do you think they were saying at the time, and how does that apply now?
Well, I think at the time there was a very broad mix of religious views in the among the founding fathers, but the idea of separation of church and state was particularly an idea that was invented by Roger Williams. He was a Baptist, and he, as far as I know, was one of the first people to ever use those words in writing. And his writing then went on to influence people up to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who incorporated his ideas into the Bill of Rights and into the Constitution. So though they may have believed in a God or a deistic version or a more intrusive, active God, along the various religions that they held, I think they recognized that different people of good character could have different ideas as to what that was, and so therefore they wanted to make it as expansive as possible and include as many different views on the subject as possible.
What do you think Roger Williams would say about Rhode Island right now and about the great experiment, the lively experiment?
I don't know that he would like everything he's seeing, that's for sure. I do know, however, that he did specifically call out atheists as people who deserve rights just like everyone else. He called them anti-theists because there was no word atheist at the time, but people who stood against God should have all the rights of people like him who were Christians, Baptists, or anybody else. Jews, Muslims, he called them Turks.
Right. Well, I think he felt you couldn't compel someone to believe something they don't believe.
Exactly.
So why use the force of law on something like that?
Right.
The question arises all the time from folks who would criticize your movement, that somehow your idea of a separation of church and state impinges on their right to worship God.
Yeah, and I don't know that I've ever said or done or written anything that would indicate that I would want to go into a church and tell you how to conduct yourself there. And in fact, I know I haven't. And I've also worked very hard with ministers and rabbis in groups to try to secure basic religious rights for everybody. But that also includes, basic religious rights include the right of a person who believes it's okay to marry two men, and a person who doesn't believe it's right to not do the same thing. So Catholics might not want to marry two men, but a Congregationalist or Unitarian might say, yes, I would like to have this right. Why should the Catholics' right predominate? Why should that be in charge of the state? And so when I say separation, I say separate the churches from the state. Let the churches marry who they want, and then the state will decide the issues that are more pertinent, more important, or more less religious-y.
One of our constant discussions here is the notion that libertarians and folks who are legitimately green and progressive agree on so many things, more than we'd ever believe, and yet at the same time have vastly different ways to get there. Libertarians embrace the notion that government should be out of the marriage business, right, that it should be limited strictly to a contractual property arrangement, and then you are free to imbue it with any religious connotations you might want separate of that contract, all right, in your own private religious tradition. What say you?
Well, I think there was a time when that view could have predominated, and I think had the religious right in this country been smart, they could have gone and said that there is no such thing as marriage in civil law. There is only civil unions in civil law, and that marriage would be the prescription of only churches. But they fought hard for the concept of marriage to be in civil law because they wanted to hold on to a certain amount of religious language in our law. So they fought hard for marriage to be a religious term that was encoded in law so they could say, see, church and state are not separate. But what has happened instead is that they've lost marriage to the civil process. Marriage is now a civil thing, and you can bless it. You can do all sorts of things with your religion to make it something more or religious. But in essence, you're absolutely right. Marriage is no more than a contractual arrangement between two people.
One that is constantly broken, by the way.
Well, true. Yes, it is. But at the same time, I think we've amended that, right? Because we have contract law that says you can marry two people together, and then at a certain point they can separate as well. And the separation follows certain types of law and ways that the property will be divided upon the dissolvement of the marriage.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There's a organization based in the Midwest. I believe it's Wisconsin. The Freedom from Religion.
I know them. Yes.
Okay. There's a feeling, let me throw a couple things at you. The first one is there's a feeling amongst Christians, particularly members of the Christian right, that these folks are almost on a reverse witch hunt, that they seemingly, and I know you're not part of that organization,
Right.
but just I'd be interested in your comments, that they seem to be targeting a variety of long-held, yet I'll call it statistically insignificant crosses, memorializations, basic functions. You know, when they talked about, the Catholicism in the 13th, 14th century, they talked about how religious folks would obsess over how many angels you could fit on a pinhead.
Right.
And the bizarre, the innocuous and the bizarre. Is that organization, or organizations like that, I should say, seemingly diffusing their issue by obsessing over monuments, or do you think that's a valid, critical point to draw in the sand?
As far as monuments go, it's not a critical point, but it certainly is a rallying point, and I think it can be indicative of other things in society that we take for granted, like legislative prayer. Every legislative session in Rhode Island seems to open with a prayer, and other types of religious stuff that's in our society all the time. You mentioned jokingly before we started about the "In God We Trust" and a dollar bill. That's there, but should it be there? Should under God be in the Pledge of Allegiance? Is that really? I mean, it says one nation, indivisible, but then we say one nation under God, indivisible, as if we're dividing it between people who believe in God, people who don't. We're saying it's indivisible, but guess what? We divided it with under God.
That was inserted during the Cold War.
Yes, it was, and so was the money. So was the phrase on the money, and so was the so were a lot of these monuments that were put up. All the Ten Commandment monuments were all put up after the movie Ten Commandments came out. So that was also in the 50s. So was
that's actually pretty funny.
It is. It's also the cross in one socket that they've complained, FFRF has complained about, was also put up in the 1950s. These all things came out of a Cold War mentality where we were trying to be anti-Russian, anti-communist, and therefore we doubled down on our religiosity. But in a sense, these are all aberrations. And so what they're doing, the best thing you can say about the FFRF is maybe they're playing cleanup for things that have been around for way too long.
How does one then, if I'll say inflict, and I use that word intentionally, how does one inflict a quote-unquote moral code in the absence of religion?
I think let's see. There's a moral code, but then there's also what we would think of as laws, right? The rule of law. So if we have a rule of law, then in a sense, the moral code shouldn't matter. That should be something impersonal within each and every one of us, right? I have morals, I have ethics, I have things I believe, and I act a certain way in society. But the rule of law, even if I didn't believe certain things like murder was wrong, the rule of law makes sure that I do not murder too many people before I go to jail and I'm put away for life, hopefully. So I think that's how we do it. We don't do it through churches telling us, thou shalt not kill. We do it through, we'll put you in jail when you kill people. I mean, that seems to be sensible to me.
Another set of criticisms that comes from, I'll call it the mass at large, is that a lot of this cleanup, as you call it, is directed squarely at Christianity, yet at the same time, it would appear in this country, you've got the public nature of Christianity being tamped down. You can agree or disagree on how appropriate that is. That's a separate argument. But the public role of Islam is being allowed to grow unfettered to the point where there are portions of this nation where Sharia law is starting to be actually, recognized, for lack of a better term. Why is there, for example, and again, you don't belong to that organization,
right.
but in your thoughts, why is there this double standard arising, Islam versus Christianity?
I don't think it's a double standard, and I'll tell you this: first of all, in this country, Christianity is the religion that has actually abused the law the most. I mean, there's more Christians in this country than anywhere else. We've had more years for them to take power in different places and to insert themselves into public policy and public debate, whereas Islam isn't really doing the same thing. And to the extent that Islam is trying to impose Sharia law, if that were to ever happen, you can bet that groups like the FFRF and my own would be squarely against that. I mean, if somebody introduced a Sharia law bill in the state assembly, you can bet I would be right there saying no way. And I think I would have not only myself, but I would have a bunch of people from a bunch of different religions and non-religions right behind me saying no way. I don't even think we'd find that many Muslims who would say in this state, let's impose Sharia law. And in fact, I know so.
But yet in parts of Michigan,
there's some places up there, but I don't think, that you're going to see that encoded into actual law. I really don't. I would I mean, England is dealing with this right now in a very real way. They're actually looking at the legislation to impose some Sharia courts, and it's a very contentious issue, and I don't think it's going to pass there. So I don't see it happening.
The analogy you draw earlier, I'd like to use on this. I mean, if there's a movement analogous to the Red Menace, and I mean that in all ways, both the fact that the Red Menace was in some sense legitimate, and other senses completely hyped to create a sense of fear in this country so that, people's civil liberties can be denied. I believe that the threat of Islam occupies that same role as the Red Menace. It is the bogeyman that's being used politically.
Yes.
On the other hand, they did attack us, and they here in the United States, and they've exhibited anti-Western feelings, not against so much our religion. I mean, they use that as their own bogeyman, but against the standard of living that the West observes.
There's probably a lot of complex forces that work there, and I'm not going to try to make excuses for the actions of Al-Qaeda in any way. In fact, I'm not a big fan of that kind of any religion, but particularly violent religion. So, that's obviously wrong. But at the same time, I don't see Islam growing in America at any startling rates that is giving us pause. We don't have to worry about secret Islamists in our midst, or start to have loyalty oaths to make sure people are Muslim or something. I don't think that's the case. I think it's overinflated. I really do. In America, most Muslims are part of the American dream. They want to be in this country, and they want to do things in this country because they see this country as functioning in a certain way. I don't believe we have the same instances that we have in Europe, where people are holding on to their identity and their Muslim identity and setting up what we might even call little Muslim enclaves. France is dealing with this in a big way because France is so hard to assimilate into the French culture. But America, you're here for a generation. You're pretty much an American. It doesn't take much to become an American.
What do you see? I mean, let's make some predictions in the few minutes we have left.
Sure.
Based on your how you feel on the pulse of Rhode Island, do you see the Catholic Church gaining in political power or starting to fade away?
I see them as being here for a very long time. I don't think their political power is what they think it is. I don't think it ever has been. I think what it is that people in a General Assembly think the church is really powerful and speaks for a lot of people, but if you actually look at what Catholics in Rhode Island believe, they do not believe the stuff the church is selling. Most Catholic women use birth control. Most Catholics in Rhode Island were in favor of marriage equality. More Catholics were in favor of marriage equality than non-Catholics were in favor of marriage equality in this state. So when the church says these things, they're not really speaking for their rank and file. They're speaking for the Catholic hierarchy. So in that sense, I don't think they've ever really had the power they think they have. It's just the General Assembly thinks they do and reacts when they put even the littlest bit of pressure on them.
There's a moment in Shakespeare where a king preaches to the oceans to stop, and they don't.
Right.
Did our Archbishop have that little ocean moment with marriage equality? And
I think he's going to have it with the Obamacare as well, with the exceptions for churches and stuff. I think what we're going to see is that the more they complain about things like birth control and divorce and marriage equality, the more they're going to lose. I think there are better places they can concentrate on things like the death penalty and poverty and issues and immigration. These are issues the church is very strong on and can do a lot of good work on and find real allies for, whereas the other place, I think they find themselves in a marginal position and they're not going to really succeed there.
Well, I've generally noticed that people in general, and Catholics in particular, will gravitate toward the specific teachings of the church that line up with their existing political feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So the progressive Catholics will ignore the birth control issues in favor of the social justice issues, and vice versa.
I also think that's true, yes.
So do you mean they're cafeteria Catholics like our Republicans are cafeteria conservatives?
Yeah, basically.
Oh, okay.
People start with their firmly held beliefs and then find justifications for them.
So in a sense,
not the other way around.
People reverse engineer religion.
Yeah, they reverse engineer religion, they reverse engineer their own politics, their own arguments in favor of or against political issues or religious issues.
Is there a candidate currently running for political office on the executive level, governor, what do they call them, the top five, the big cheeses, that has been open or is willing to listen to your positions, or are they just also, or basically do they pander to everybody?
I haven't had anybody come to me and ask me for my endorsement or anything. I don't think we're big enough or interesting enough or group, and I also think that we're slightly polarizing. So I think that if people in power are like what we're saying, I don't think they're going to come out and say it too often because they're worried about what it might look like to say, hey, I think the atheists have a good point. So I haven't had any close conversations with any big politicians.
How does your movement work beyond the polarization? I mean, how do you take issues that are sensitive and nuanced and get them out of the, as we call it here, the arena of outrage porn? How do you do that?
Well, I do it by being very consistent and very calm. When I don't, you've read some of my writings, and I try very hard not to make like gigantic verbose statements. I try not to over talk or be loud or obnoxious, and I try to basically make the point honestly. I'm open for debate, and I also try very hard to look at the facts and present it the best I can. And then as long as I'm consistent and polite and insistent when it calls for it, then I think we get our point across.
Chris, what was that look when he said verbose and overbearing? Who was that directed to?
No comment.
Okay.
Nobody here.
Nobody I know.
No. Okay, good.
Yeah. Predictions. Where do you think you'll be 3 to 5 years from now as a movement? What's your next big goal, and where do you see your successes coming from?
I think from an organizational point of view is like to get our group a little bit more organized. As much as we're we have about 300 members, I'd like to do things that will get us a little bit more together on our decision making. So that's just all internal. External, I think we're going to continue to do what we do. We're going to continue to go to State House. We're going to continue to press for issues that we're interested in, and we're going to continue to make our best case to the state that a secular society is preferable to one that's influenced too much by any one particular theology.
As a libertarian, I can tell you the biggest challenge about being involved in an organization that does not believe in controls or rigid structures is trying to get people organized, right, Tony?
Herding cats, baby. Herding cats.
Yes, it is. And I think you have the same problem among atheists and humanists. They are very cat-like, but yes. No, that's great. I think your approach is correct. I think you have to just provide a consistent message as you're surrounded by the Sturm und Drang and the dramas du jour of Rhode Island politics. I mean, when you look at some of the leading characters, I think you'll outlive some of the current crisis queens in the General Assembly.
Unfortunately, we do have to hold it there. Our in-studio guest has been Steve Ahlquist. Steve, how do folks access your blog?
You can go to rhodeislandfuture.org or steveahlquist.com.
Make sure you check that out whilst you're checking out coalitionradio.us. P.O. and Chris, fantastic job as always.
Thanks, bud.
Don't forget to check out facebook.com/The Coalition Radio and on Twitter @Coalition_radio. Big shout out to all our Twitter folks. Until next time, my name is Tony Jones. Check out coalitionradio.us.